Welcome, listeners and subscribers, to Immersion Radio. I am your host. Gregg Everman is my name, and doing Immersion Radio and whatever it is we're doing is my game. Today's talk is about, hopefully, video games, ancient history to modern day culture. Now, I'm a video game historian. I love older games. I'm not necessarily into new games. New games are pretty darn bad. And let's face it, over the last, perhaps 10 years, games have really gone to seed. I call the age of 2004 to 2009 the golden age. And wherein most games were very high quality. Nowadays, most games are not very high quality, and despite their very much inflated budgets compared to their predecessors, they are not half the games that their predecessors were. Now, today I'm going to be taking a look at Final Fantasy games. Now, I haven't played every Final Fantasy game, but I think I've played enough to consider myself somewhat of an expert. Final Fantasy 1, for example, was a very in-depth and interesting game, but at its core was just fairly basic. Very long, though. I actually never finished it, but it was very long, and there was a lot to it. The soundtrack was pretty catchy. Riding... Actually, I'm not sure if you could ride chocobos around in that game. I might be confusing that with too, but the long and short of it is, not being a named character was a little bit of a hindrance, but in the meantime, most of the game was pretty well set up, and it was a very, very good start for the Final Fantasy franchise. I believe it was back in 1987? I want to say 87. I think it was 1987. But either way, the follow-up to it, Final Fantasy 2, was a much improved version of Final Fantasy 1, I thought. Playing as the character Firion, who was pretty basic. And most of the characters were pretty basic, but the story kind of made up for any flaws that Final Fantasy II had. And there was a lot of story, a lot of art, a lot of style to it. Very, very complex and well put together. Final Fantasy III, I know very little about, but from what I've gotten, it was not really that well put together. It was a little pathetic in most respects, playing as a character called Onion Knight, and then very much returned to the Final Fantasy 1 idea of behind the whole story and everything like that. Was not that well put together. Final Fantasy 4 was much different. Final Fantasy 4 was very much like 2, but in many ways even better. Final Fantasy 4, you start as Cecil Harvey, and then there was Kane Highwind, there was... I can't even think of any of the other characters' names right now, it's been a while. But Final Fantasy 4 was very complex, and the storyline was very thorough, and there was a lot to it. Final Fantasy 4 is one of the best Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy 5 was not so great, not as many memorable moments, but there were a lot of good things from Final Fantasy 5, and I think it really kept Final Fantasy going quite well. Final Fantasy VI was a very remarkable game, very much loved by anyone who's played it. Final Fantasy VI was starring Tara Branford, I think her name was, and was more of, from what I've gotten of it so far, even though I've actually never played it, it had almost like a steampunk idea, but a very original version of it, and very, very well put together. So for you who've played 6 out there, you guys rock. Rock on, you 6 players. Final Fantasy VII, very much heralded as the greatest Final Fantasy game. I don't think so, but it did have its moments. Playing in the city of Midgar was really cool, and the entire story element to it was very well put together. The characters were very well thought through, and 7 was quite well pieced together. No one's going to deny, and a lot of the spin-offs of 7 were very good. Final Fantasy VIII, made just 1 year after 7, also had a lot of interesting stuff, and 8 also was very new and improved. No longer was everything an impression anymore. Now you could actually see the things that were happening, even though their motion capture wasn't that well pieced together, and the art didn't exactly look 100% real. That being said, it was just very, very, very well put together. But there were a lot of flaws in 8. 8 had a lot of things that people didn't like, especially the battle system was not that well pieced together, and 8 was dragged down by a lot of flaws. Final Fantasy IX was a very open world game with Zidane Tribal being the main character, and was far more fun and creative than any of its predecessors had been, from what I surmise. 9 is another game that Final Fantasy IX did indeed have its moments, and it was very heralded as being a very impressive game, which most people, a lot of people, consider their favorite Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy X, much more storyline based again. It seems that they go, one game character based, next game plot, gameplay based. Next game character, next game gameplay. Next game character, next game gameplay. It seems that that's how Final Fantasy works. But Final Fantasy X was very much oriented around storyline and the overall plot. It had a very complex and complicated plot, although there were a lot of hitches in 10, a lot of things holding it back, but it was very heralded as one of the better games in the Final Fantasy franchise. It's one that I've played, not all of it, but I've played a lot of it, and it was a very good game. Final Fantasy XI was a free roam game, very MMO, massive multiplayer online, and was not in the same spirit as pretty much any other Final Fantasy game before it, but it most certainly had its moments, and while not one of the biggest games of all time, it most certainly did leave its mark. Final Fantasy XII was considered a very poorly put together Final Fantasy game and was very story driven, but with the characters being shallow and a lot of the elements of it being very, very shallow. Final Fantasy XII, though, is considered passable, and there are a lot of fans of it out there. The characters do seem a little bit ridiculous, and a lot of the things that 12 was trying did seem to be poorly put together, especially for a game made as late as it was. But Final Fantasy XII most certainly does not rank anywhere in anyone's top list. Final Fantasy XIII was very strange and erratic. This is one game that I've played all of many times. Final Fantasy XIII was very, very, very story and character based. Probably the most of any Final Fantasy game before it, where gameplay took a complete backseat, and this disappointed a lot of people who were big fans of Final Fantasy gameplays before that. But Final Fantasy XIII did have a lot of redeeming qualities, not limited to the characters. The characters were very in-depth, although they did have some inherent character flaws. Final Fantasy XIV was another massive multiplayer online game, very much based off the idea of 11. Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XIV failed in many, many respects, including, I believe it was multiple remakes of it, multiple retakes on 14, which did seem to get a little better. A lot of the things started improving, but Final Fantasy XIV, I believe to this day, is still considered a failure. Final Fantasy 15 and the final Final Fantasy, when this video is recorded, is the most open world, I would say, the most in-depth, a lot of story elements, but not as many as character elements. And overall, Final Fantasy 15 is a very well put together production, but which does suffer from some flaws. As for offshoots, we have Crisis Core, made in 2008. It is a copy of Final Fantasy VII. It is a prequel of Final Fantasy VII. Crisis Core was very, very well put together with a very in-depth story, very appealing and enthralling characters, and a very nice take on the 7 universe. It, however, was lacking somewhat in the fact that there was no massive story to it. It was not following anything notable, just pretty much the events of the character Zack, who is Cloud's mentor, and there was reference made to him a lot in Final Fantasy VII. And as a result, the game does fall a little bit short when it comes to the overall script of it, but the sound score was very phenomenal, the atmosphere was very phenomenal, and Crisis Core is heralded as one of the better Final Fantasy games. It's on my list. It's about the 4th best Final Fantasy game. Other offshoots include 10-2, which was very much unlike its predecessor 10, and focused on the game's secondary main character, Yuna, who she goes on an adventure with her gal pals, and it was considered a very, very abominable game, and very, very few people liked it. I've seen a lot of footage of it. I've never played it myself, wouldn't want to, don't, been there, done that type of thing. and Final Fantasy X-2 was considered a very, very poor sequel to Final Fantasy X and could almost be deemed non-canon by a lot of fans. Other offshoots include the Dissidia franchise, which is a collection of all the heroes from the Final Fantasy games grouping up and doing their thing in the world of Dissidia, where they all have to fight a certain battle and die against the archenemies from those games. The Dissidia games have had their moments, especially Dissidia Duodecim. It was very in-depth, and there was a lot of gameplay features. There was also a lot of storyline features, and even the overall feel of Dissidia Duodecim is very well put together. It, however, did suffer from the flaws of being unrealistic, of being redundant, and other inherent flaws. But it does still make my list of one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time. Dissidia 3 was also not as good as Dissidia Duodecim in my opinion, but because I haven't played it, I can't make a judgment call. What I've seen of it so far, it does seem to be a half-hearted attempt at creating a fairly good game, and the CGI does seem very top-notch. To round out the list of the games which I believe are the best Final Fantasy games, I'm going to start out with the number one Final Fantasy game. I believe the number one Final Fantasy game of all time is probably Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV did have a lot of elements which were very appealing. The characters were fairly well scripted, not the best, but they were fairly well put together, and the overall universe was very top-notch, and one could play this game over and over and over again, never get tired of it, including the PlayStation Vita remaster, which was a very, very well put together CG overhaul, and which could enthrall the gamer for some time to come. Final Fantasy IV's soundtrack was also very captivating, and the overall feeling it gave the gamer was top-notch. My second best Final Fantasy game of all time is Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV, while suffering from some inherent flaws and from a very much delayed production of almost 10 years before the game was finally produced, also had a very incredible atmosphere. It had a top-notch soundtrack. It had some of the best character development and best character relations in any Final Fantasy game, if not the best character relations. Director Hirojime Tabata is perhaps one of the best at Americanizing the game, so it does have that Western feel to it. My third best game on this list is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. I believe Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core was another one of those amazing games that just combined a lot of great pieces, a lot of great gameplay, great characters. The character development was phenomenal, the great sound score, the great atmospheres, and you pool all that together and you do get one of the top Final Fantasy games. Even though the storyline was fairly blasé and didn't contain any dynamic elements, it was good enough to keep you entertained, and the characters and the music and every other element did their thing to keep you playing it. My fourth best is Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II starring Firion, Maria, Guy, and I forget who, not Leon. I forget who the final one was perhaps one of the best Final Fantasy games. Even though it was the second one, it had a very much greatly improved system over Final Fantasy I, and the story was very, very captivating. Final Fantasy XV copied a lot of elements of Final Fantasy II, and everything Final Fantasy II seemed to have a lot of effect to it. Final Fantasy II is therefore easily makes my top 5 list, and it is a very entertaining piece of Final Fantasy. The PlayStation Vita remastered that game also, and once again it was done very well. The game which makes my number 5 is Final Fantasy XIII. While Final Fantasy XIII did suffer from a lot of mechanical issues, the storyline and the character development, as well as the soundtrack, were very enthralling. They very much drew the viewer in and focused him on the positive elements of the story. Yes, Final Fantasy XIII did have a very large amount of faults and had to be taken almost more for its cinematic value than its gaming value. But as far as its cinematic value goes, it was indeed a good experience, and that is why Final Fantasy XIII makes my top 5 list. Other notable games include Final Fantasy X, which had its moments. Most certainly, it was not among my favorites, but it was a good installment. Final Fantasy Dissidia Duodecim was a very well pieced together arcade game, which very focused on gameplay, but the gameplay was very enthralling, and there were as many bonus modes as there are days in the year, and this you have to give them kudos for. Final Fantasy I also had its moments with an incredible art style and was, of course, the beginning of the Final Fantasy franchise. That alone has to get you somewhere. Final Fantasy VI for its art style, its character development, and its first shot at really getting a new element there into Final Fantasy. And of course, Final Fantasy VII was also very notable for its city, for its characters, for its much more developed story than previous Final Fantasy games. It had much more character focused and much more storyline focused approach. And those are Gregg Everman of Immersion Radio's picks for the best Final Fantasy games. And to go into more personal favorites, Final Fantasy 15 has to be, just something that I think everyone should play. You're never going to get better atmospheres than just hanging around a 1950s Western town, with the hokey soundtrack playing in the background. In the meantime, you're just, heading to a crow's nest to buy food. You really can't beat that kind of atmosphere. Even though the game did have a lot of problems in the storyline, the free roam atmosphere was just incredible, and some of the bonus missions were very well thought through. Could have perhaps used a little more story depth, but still were very well thought through. As for Final Fantasy 13, some of the set designs of Final Fantasy 13 were beyond extraordinary. The Nautilus theme park was incredible. The visuals there could stagger the imagination. You also had some of the set designs like Orphan's Cradle in the very final mission, a very incredible set design with the sound score in the background playing a perfect eerie sound while you fight enemies to open portals and to finish the game. There were also dozens of other good set designs. The opening set design you start out in was not very good and did not really start the game on a positive note, but after that the set designs only got better and better and better. This was 13's perhaps number one asset, was their art. And then in Crisis Core, while we don't have the set designs, we don't have the CG, we don't have the motion capture because it was only a PlayStation portable game. At the same time, we have such good sound, such good feel from the parts, such incredible passion put behind the project that you almost have to just put this up there with any top 10 Final Fantasy list. You have to put Crisis Core in the top 5. It does everything that is necessary for a top 5, and once again, with low budget, one is almost at an advantage over someone who has high budget, because with low budget you come in with low expectations and all you can do is go up, and this often encourages the designers to go up instead of always sinking and just creating something that no one cares about. Whereas with a game like Final Fantasy 15, where their budget was almost unlimited, they very much struggled to get the project off. The project did eventually get off, and it was perhaps one of the top 5 Final Fantasy games. In my opinion, it might be the second best Final Fantasy game, but 15 did suffer from having too much money for their own good. Final Fantasy 13-2 is also another notable game where the art style was very much copied off Final Fantasy 13-1, which was both good and bad. Good for a bit of continuity, bad because they were just repurposing it 100%, where they would even just copy the exact same set design from the predecessor. 13-2 also suffered from problems of completely changing the story from the original, adding in new elements which made no sense at all and were completely unnecessary for the 13 universe. 13-2 also suffered from poor character development, where every character seemed, acted, and was pretty much the exact same. There was also no faithfulness at all to the first 13 game, which was a very big mistake. However, the elements that 13-2 did invent and did have in their game were very interesting, and there was a lot of intrigue to 13-2. The sound score by Masashi Hamauzu was also very well put together, and a lot of fans could get behind 13-2's approach to Final Fantasy, despite the fact that it had very little to do with Final Fantasy 13. 13.3, however, was a complete write-off. Fans could not care less about it. There was nothing worthwhile in the entire game. The characters were copied off of their predecessors, including in their costumes, to the point where they wouldn't even change their costumes, but they would just give them the costume of the previous game, all except for Lightning and Snow. Lightning's costumes were some of the worst in the world, so it almost doesn't matter anyway. But Final Fantasy 13.3 was a disgrace to the Final Fantasy franchise and has very little reason for being. This concludes my review of Final Fantasy games. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and get some popcorn out, because more content is on the way. Already, thousands of videos are planned, millions of videos are planned, even billions of videos are planned. I'm telling you, like, they're just going to be coming at you so fast that you'll be saying, Gregg, stop making videos. But I won't listen to you, because I will keep making videos until the long days of my life are utterly spent. Lord of the Rings Inside Line. Lord of the Rings Return of the King, by the way, is arguably the best movie of all time. Subscribe to Lord of the Rings. That has been all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.